In the mid-19th century, John Keats' The Eve of St. Agnes emerged as a foundational blueprint for a new generation of British painters. The artists of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were captivated by the poem's intense pictorialism. Keats' sensory descriptions provided a ready-made visual language, allowing painters to translate his stanzas directly into meticulously detailed scenes of medieval life. This eventual status as a visual masterpiece masks a significant historical hurdle. Upon its first publication in 1820, the poem met a critical environment that was largely indifferent to its charms. Keats died only months after its release, convinced his work was a failure. For the next 30 years, the poem remained in a critical dead zone, largely ignored by the broader reading public. To understand why this work required 3 decades to find its audience, we have to examine the specific structural mechanics of the text and the ambitious goals Keats set for himself in 1819. The evidence suggests that Keats built a poem that fundamentally prioritized descriptive density over the narrative speed his contemporaries expected. During the Regency era, the long narrative poem occupied the highest tier of literary prestige. While short lyrics were common, a long-form narrative was considered the true measure of a poet's architectural skill and commercial viability. This era saw a shift away from the rigid, symmetrical, heroic couplets of the 18th century. Poets were increasingly adopting the metrical romance, a more fluid, expansive format that allowed for immersive world-building. Keats viewed the long poem as the ultimate test of what he termed invention. He believed a true poet must build a sustainable world for the reader to inhabit, rather than merely reflecting a passing emotion. He described the experience he wanted to provide as a week's stroll, a narrative that offered enough detail and texture for a reader to wander through for days. Keats engineered The Eve of St. Agnes to compete at this professional level. Every technical choice was designed to maximize structural endurance and visual depth, even at the cost of narrative momentum. For his structural framework, Keats chose the Spenserian stanza, a complex form borrowed from the 16th century epic, The Faerie Queene. The stanza is mathematically rigorous. It requires 9 lines following an intricate A-B-A-B, B-C, B-C-C rhyme scheme. The defining feature of this form is the Alexandrine, a final line containing 12 syllables, whereas the first 8 lines contain only 10. This extra length functions as a mechanical break. It prevents the reader from rushing through the narrative, forcing a slow, meditative pace at the conclusion of every stanza. Keats filled this slowed-down space with dense, tactile imagery. He utilized archaic diction and compound adjectives, like poppied warmth or argent revelry, to increase the sensory information in every line. This technique led 18th century critics to describe Keats's style as poésie de vitrail, or stained glass poetry. By combining a slow reading speed with high-density adjectives, Keats transformed each stanza into a self-contained visual panel, prioritizing the reader's internal vision over the progress of the plot. This suggests the poem's eventual success with painters was a direct result of Keats's decision to sacrifice narrative speed in favor of absolute visual density. While the poem feels like a singular vision, its plot is actually a sophisticated synthesis of several disparate historical and literary sources. The foundational layer is the medieval folklore of the saint Agnes ritual, where young women were told they could see their future husbands in a dream if they followed specific rites of fasting and prayer. To this folklore, Keats added the dramatic tension of Shakespearean tragedy, specifically the architecture of feuding families found in Romeo and Juliet. He also drew from Shakespeare's darker voyeuristic tropes in Cymbeline and The Rape of Lucrece to construct the scene of the hidden lover. Finally, Keats integrated the structural sequence of Giovanni Boccaccio's Renaissance romance, Il Filicolo. Boccaccio provided the precise beats for the story's climax, the involvement of a complicit old nurse, and the specific moment Madeline wakes to find her dream lover standing before her. Keats' innovation resides in the seamless architectural fusion of these disparate European traditions into a single cohesive narrative. But if the poem was so meticulously engineered, why did the audience of 1820 fail to embrace it? In 1820, the literary market was dominated by the fast-paced, action-heavy narratives of Walter Scott and Lord Byron. The public was conditioned to expect stories that moved with propulsive energy. Keats's use of the Spenserian stanza stood in direct opposition to this trend. His stanzas forced a slow, static, and meditative experience on a readership that was currently paying for high-speed action. Reviewers at the time often characterized this dense style as overly ornamented. They viewed Keats's intricate descriptions as an obstacle to the story, rather than its primary merit. Keats effectively produced an intricate, slow-moving painting for a market that was primarily interested in the literary equivalent of an action movie. Pacing was not the only point of conflict. The poem also challenged the moral boundaries of the Regency literary establishment. During his final revisions in 1819, Keats attempted to make the encounter between Madeline and Porphyro more explicit, removing the ambiguity of the original draft. His publisher immediately suppressed these changes. He feared such blatant sensuality would be branded unfit for ladies and lead to a total commercial failure. Taylor understood the market. He knew that the conservative reviewers at the Edinburgh Review would use any hint of eroticism to destroy the book's reputation. Keats's obsession with physical beauty and the erotic moment placed him in direct conflict with the rigid moral expectations of his publishers and his audience. The poem's institutional suppression highlights a fundamental incompatibility between Keats's unapologetic sensuality and the rigid moral boundaries of the Regency publishing world. By the time of Keats's death, The Eve of St. Agnes appeared a victim of its own design, too slow and far too sensual for its era. However, the cultural landscape shifted toward the mid-19th century. As the influence of Alfred Lord Tennyson grew, the reading public began to value the very kind of atmospheric imagery that Keats had pioneered. When the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood emerged in 1848, they were looking for literary models that could justify their focus on medievalism and hyper-detailed visual art. In Keats, they found a poet who had already solved their primary problem: the mechanics that alienated 1820s readers, slow pacing, dense adjectives, European sourcing, were exactly what these painters needed to translate poetry into visual masterpieces. Keats's calculated experiment eventually succeeded. He built a bridge between the Romantic narrative and the Victorian visual movement, ensuring his legacy as a poet of permanent pictorial depth.